This is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5 Watt World, where we're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. This is the next video in my series on the history of famous gear. Today, we're talking about the Fender Deluxe Amplifier. Up next. One of the Woodie amps, the story goes that Leo Fender received a shipment of hardwood that was too narrow to build his lap steel guitars. So rather than let it go unused, he designed Fender's first amps so it could be put to good use. Supposedly, the metal strips on the front were Leo trying to give it a stylish automotive look. The earliest Deluxes sported the designation Model 26 on the control panel. They featured a 10-inch speaker, 5 octal tubes, and to a 12-watt design. It had 3 inputs, 2 instrument, and 1 for a microphone, along with 2 volumes and 1 tone control. The TV front Deluxes were made from 1948 to 1954. The type of phase inverter used at that time was less hi-fi than those that came later, and imparts a certain amount of grittiness. For this reason, there isn't much headroom, but the overdrive is a wonderful thing. The 1954-1955 wide panel design was a transitional model. It was the first to use the now more familiar miniature 9-pin preamp tubes common today, using a 12AY7 and a 12AX7 in the preamp like the narrow panel amps to come. And now we do come to the 5E3 Narrow Panel Deluxe. Produced from 1955 to 1960, this is the pinnacle of Tweed Deluxe circuits. In broad strokes, it makes between 10 and 14 watts from its pair of 6V6 power tubes and 5Y3 rectifier into a 12-inch speaker. The cabinet was about the same size as a modern Princeton. The 5E3 had a different phase inverter and more voltage, giving it more clean headroom and its unique mid-range snarl. Carl Carrasco of Carl's Custom Amp notes, "It's absolutely a classic-sounding amp. There's not a lot of cleans there, but they are angelic, and the overdrive is gritty, warm, and punchy." Fender used many different transformers during this time period, and along with component variation, it's one of the reasons that Tweed Deluxes are so different from amp to amp. Famously, Neil Young has searched a lifetime for a backup for his favorite 59, and though he's gotten close, he says he's never quite found its equal. Other famous users of Tweed Deluxes? Larry Carlton, of course. See the intro to Steely Dan's Don't Take Me Alive for that ultimate tone demo. And check out his Premier Guitar rig rundown to hear studio stories of his famous 5E3. And of course, Mike Campbell, mentioned in my previous video on the Princeton amps, pairs a 5E3 with his non-reverb Blackface Princeton in his stage rig. A narrow panel Deluxe is also supposed to have been one of the early house amps at Rudy Van Gelder's studio, where so many early Blue Note jazz guitar parts were recorded. Listen to very early Grant Green records for a taste of that. Scotty Moore, Steve Cropper, Don Felder, The Edge, and of course Neil Young, were or are famous 5E3 users. It's a big list. Vintage 5E3s are expensive, but the good news is that there's lots of clones in the marketplace to choose from. From 1961 to 1963, Fender built the brownface Deluxe. The brownface saw the addition of tremolo, retaining a simple volume and tone of the Tweed era, becoming a 2-channel amp at this time, with a normal channel and a bright channel. The biggest shift, besides the cabinet changes and the move to the brown Tolex and wheat grille, is the move from cathode bias to fixed bias. It would take an entire video to cover the technical differences of bias circuits, but let me try to describe the differences in sound and wattage as they impact the Deluxe. Cathode biased amps generally have greater sustain and dynamics, but with more sag and a spongier feel. In contrast, fixed bias amps are firmer and stay cleaner longer. If all factors are equal, a cathode biased amp like the Tweeds will distort sooner. Fixed biased amps are going to stay cleaner, giving you more headroom and having greater efficiency. The move to fixed biasing and a different phase inverter circuit in the brownface amp boosted the power up to a dependable 15 watts. The tone of the brownface Deluxe is often described as sitting somewhere halfway between that of a Tweed and a Blackface Deluxe. David Allen from Allen Amps told me he's always thought of the brownface Deluxe as Fender's 18-watter. He added that the circuit is pretty gained up, similar to the Marshall 18-watt amps from the mid-60s. And he's always been surprised that Leo Fender let them go out that way, since Leo is always a kind of a country guy and was famously more interested in clean tones. So how do they sound? Ted Nugent's Cat Scratch Fever was recorded with a brownface Deluxe. And if anything can be believed from Reverend Billy G's gear stories, ZZ Top's Jesus Just Left Chicago and other Tres Hombres album classics were recorded with a brownface Deluxe. 1963 saw the transition to the Blackface Deluxe, and famously, the introduction of the Deluxe Reverb. The controls now included separate bass and treble controls on each channel, tremolo speed and intensity, and a mix control for the reverb. The two channels were relabeled normal and vibrato. In the Blackface amp circuit, the phase inverter is changed again, and that along with more voltage yields the 20 watts we see in modern Deluxes today. Just 1 year after the sale of Fender to CBS in 1965, somewhat eclipsed by the newer reverb model, the non-reverb Deluxe was dropped from the line in '66. The list of Blackface users is pretty endless, but includes such notable and diverse players as Mike Bloomfield, Chet Atkins, Eric Johnson, Trey Anastasio, Brent Mason, and J.D. Simo. Interestingly, in 2014, Eric Johnson modified his classic 4-amp stage rig when he toured with Mike Stern in support of their new album. Instead of his traditional pair of twins, he carried two Blackface Deluxe Reverbs to achieve his signature stereo chorus clean sound. In 1968, the Silverface color scheme came to the Deluxe Reverb as well. The Silverface amps are very nearly the same circuit as their Blackface ancestors. So how are they different? The gear page and TDPRI are full of strings of the differences in the sound between Blackface and Silverface amps, and this debate includes the Deluxe Reverb. It would be a huge understatement to say that opinions vary. But after extensive reading, I'd say that in general, the Silverface amps are thought to have a bit more headroom and have a slightly tighter, punchier sound. It's also generally thought that the manufacturing got increasingly sloppy in the Silverface years. And according to Dan Lurie at FYD Amps, the attitude at Fender seemed to be to add parts to the circuit to avoid any potential oscillations that might come from the looser manufacturing conditions as time went by. The process by which a Silverface amp is brought closer to Blackface spec has even given rise to a new verb, blackfacing. According to Dan, removing the additional parts that were added to prevent possible oscillations in the Silverface years is always part of the blackfacing process. Remember, all the original Blackface and Silverface amps are now between 35 and 50 years old. In that amount of time, it's possible that as capacitors and resistors age, those values can drift. Also, many of the parts used had tolerances of plus or minus 20%. 20%. Even when the amps are new, this would explain a lot of differences from one amp to another. Finally, for me, one of the biggest differences in reverb amps is the specific sound of the reverb. Each pan sounds different. It's both mechanical, the springs, and electrical. When I'm watching these videos where they're comparing two reverb amps, it's the difference in the depth and flavor of the reverb that seems to stand out to me, oftentimes obscuring the tone of the amp itself. So yes, the Silverface amps sound different, but all amps from these eras were subtly or markedly different depending on a lot of factors. Here we can see Mike Stern using a pair of 68 Silverface Deluxes from that same tour with Eric Johnson. The Silverface Deluxe Reverb was discontinued in 1982. Fender has since used the name Deluxe on a number of very different amps, including one of the most popular amps of all time, the Hot Rod Deluxe. But that amp is not directly based on any of these earlier circuits. Having said that, there are no less than 5 Deluxe amp reissues currently in Fender's catalog that are based on these circuits. The 57 Custom Deluxe, the Edge Signature Deluxe, are all based on the narrow panel 5E3 circuit. Reissues currently in production based on the Blackface and Silverface design include the Custom Shop 64 Deluxe Reverb, 65 Deluxe Reverb, and the 68 Custom Deluxe Reverb. That's my short history of the Fender Deluxe. It's a short video, so I hope I've given you the highlights. I'm sure I can count on you to add what I missed in the comments. If you liked the video, click the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and click that too. Remember to press the bell icon if you want to be notified about new videos. Until next time, thanks for being part of the 5 Watt world.